Second video. This will be the first video talking about a serial killer, and I hope this is not a way to speedrun shadow bans here on YouTube. Let's begin. Someone who enjoyed power, control, and used psychological torture to fulfill his fantasies, and also someone who would eventually crave fame and recognition. This is the story of Dennis Rader, also known as BTK. Dennis was born on March the 9th, 1945 in Pittsburgh, Kansas, and grew up in Wichita. He was the son of Dorothea and William Rader. Both parents worked long hours and paid little attention to their children. Dennis felt ignored and resented his mother for this, but that's practically everything we can say about his parents. At a young age, he became obsessed with violent thoughts and sexual fantasies, acting some out like torturing and hanging animals, practicing voyeurism, and stealing women's underwear. After graduating from school, he attended university for 1 year and dropped out. Then, he served in the Air Forces for 4 years. On discharge, he moved back to Wichita. He married Paula Dietz in 1971 and had 2 children. After this, he attended university again, earning an associate's degree in electronics in 1973. The next year, 1974, when Rader was 27 years old, the murders would begin. His first target was the Otero family. The day was January the 15th, 1974. Around 8 in the morning, 4 members of the Otero family were in the house. Both parents and 2 of their children, Joseph and Josephine. Dennis had already planned his course of action and prepared the objects he would need. He cut the phone lines, went to the back door, and entered the house when one of the children, Joseph, opened it. Once inside, he pulled out a gun and pointed it at Mr. Otero. He was expecting to find only Mrs. Otero and 2 children, and was surprised to find Mr. Otero in the house too. He pretended to be a criminal escaping from the police, and told them that he needed a car, some food and money, and after that he would leave. He told them he didn't want to hurt them and reassured them that everything will work out just fine. He proceeded to tie them up, sometimes even acting friendly, loosening their bonds a bit. Once they were all immobilized, the show was over, and his true nature came out. Mr. Otero was the first one. Dennis put a plastic bag on his head and strangled him with a piece of cord. He moved on to Mrs. Otero and her daughter, Josephine, and strangled them too. They both passed out for some time. When Mrs. Otero regained consciousness, she begged him to let her son live. Dennis strangled her again, finishing her off this time. He then took Joseph to another bedroom and put a bag on his head. Police found a chair with a broken rung and proposed that Dennis had brought a chair from Josephine's room along with her and sat the little girl on his lap, forcing her to see how her brother suffocated to death. And the broken rung would be the result of the girl struggling to keep from watching his brother die. He then took her down to the basement. Once there, he tied her up in a web of cord all around her wrist, waist, knees and ankles. He took his time to do this and appreciated this moment, even if it meant that the rest of the Otero children arrived at their house. He hung her to a pipe. She had to be in the perfect position that he had planned for her. He proceeded to masturbate and left sperm on her leg. After this, he cleaned up the house and left. After Rader had left, the other 3 children of the family came back from school and found the dead bodies. The line was dead, so they called for the neighbors' help. He hurried into the house and saw the dead bodies. He assumed that the father had gone crazy and killed his own family, to then take his own life. This is what he finally told the police when they arrived. Dennis's next murder would occur shortly after. 3 months after the Otero's homicides, he would find his next victim, Catherine Bright. On April the 4th, 1974, one of Bright's neighbors saw a young man covered in blood who was asking for help. He assisted him and drove him to the emergency room. A police officer arrived to the house minutes later. He entered the house and saw Catherine lying on her side in a puddle of blood. She was asking for help, her breath growing shallower every time. Kathy had been tied to a chair with a pair of nylons, but had somehow broken free and crawled out to the phone. She dialed the operator, but the attacker had crushed her larynx, so she was unable to utter anything besides a raspy howl. The police officer reassured her and called an ambulance, but there was nothing the doctors could do to save her. She had been stabbed 11 times in her torso and died 5 hours later. After this event, her brother told the police everything he could remember. They had returned to Kathy's house, and when they entered, they found a man inside, waiting for them. Just as he told the Oteros, he said he was escaping from the police and needed a car and some money. He pointed a gun at them and walked them into one of the bedrooms. They saw that on one of the beds, he had already laid down the ropes he would use. He bound Kathy to a chair and Kevin was tied up on the ground. He told Kathy to walk to the next room. She managed to do it, and he followed her. Kevin felt some minutes pass, and then the man entered the room again. He wrapped something around his neck and started pulling tight. Kevin began twisting his arms back and forth, and finally, he could set his arms free. But then the man pulled out his gun, pointed at his forehead, and pulled the trigger. The bullet knocked him over, and he lay unconscious for a few moments. He regained consciousness and untied his legs, but the man came back. Kevin jumped on him to try and take his gun, but he failed, and the attacker pointed his gun at him again. He shot, but missed, then shot again, and this time the bullet hit Kevin in the mouth. Luckily, the bullet was deflected by one of his teeth, but he fell down on the ground unconscious again. When he woke up, his sister was still screaming. He made the decision to look for help and ran out through the front door. Once outside, he came across his neighbor and was taken to the hospital. In that same year, 1974, a guy named Gary Sebring was arrested for molesting a little girl in a public library. As he was questioned for this incident, he made an off-topic comment on the Otero's case. He mentioned how he would have carried out the murder with his brother. This blew up and received media coverage. In the end, none of them were actually charged with the crime, but this attention towards them annoyed the real killer. On October the 22nd, he telephoned the Otero murder hotline. He said in a very irritated voice that the man who killed the Otero family had put a letter inside a mechanical engineering book on the second floor of the Wichita Public Library, and then he hung up. Police found the book, and it contained a letter inside. The letter contained the name Bill Thomas Kill, an acronym for BTK, and had several syntactic errors and misspelled words to disguise his writing. A detail worth mentioning is that this was the original letter, not a photocopy. The attention the other guys received hurt his ego so badly that he was okay with sending physical evidence to the police, even if it meant they could trace him with it. The letter contained details about the specific positions in which he had left the bodies of the Otero family, and stated that he did it all by himself. The other guys had nothing to do with it. He then proceeded to excuse himself, as the letter explained that it was impossible for him to control the monster inside of him, that other people wouldn't want to help him, and that this monster has already chosen his next victim. And finally, he suggested a name for which he will be known for the rest of his life. The code words for me will be bind them, torture them, kill them, BTK. In this letter, Rader wouldn't claim responsibility for the Catherine crime, due to the fact that there was a living witness. Dennis had an ability to blend in with common people. He continued his life as normal. He enrolled at Wichita State University and graduated in 1979. He had also been working since 1974 installing security alarms as part of his job, in many cases for homeowners concerned about the BTK killings. Dennis went silent for 3 years and struck again in 1977. Shirley Vian and her 3 children were at home the morning of March the 17th, 1977. She sent one of them, Steve, to a nearby grocery store. As he returned, a stranger stopped him and showed him a photograph. It was the photograph of a family. He asked him if he'd seen them or if he knew who they were. The boy said no to both questions, and after some insistence, the man let him go. As the boy was walking off, he turned to see the man once more, and saw him knocking on the neighbor's door. Steve kept walking and finally got home. After some minutes of watching TV, he heard someone knocking on his door. Steve opened the door and saw the same man from before, standing there on his front step. This time, the man said he had lost his dog, and asked the boy if he had seen it. After the child had said no, the stranger suggested asking his mother. "Is she at home?" he asked, while peering inside. He pushed past him, got to the living room, and turned off the TV. The 3 children were looking at him, and then he pulled out his gun. "Where is your mother?" he demanded. Shirley heard the stranger's voice and came out of her room. "What the hell are you doing? Who the hell are you?" she cried. The man turned around and threatened her with a weapon. He pushed the kids into the bathroom. He tied the doorknob and pushed the bed against the door so they couldn't come out. And, at gunpoint, he forced Shirley to cooperate, promising not to hurt the children if she did so. He told her to get into the bedroom and tied her up naked on the bed. Then, as with his other victims, he strangled her with a length of cord. One of the kids punched the window open, cutting himself in the process. He then kicked the bottom panel of the door and could get out, but the man had vanished, and his mother was laying dead on her bed. Dennis left due to a phone call they received as the kid was punching the window. Investigators suspected that the photograph he showed Steve was a picture of his neighbors, and they just happened not to be at home at that time. So Dennis improvised and went for the first target he could find. His ways were changing, and now Dennis found himself comfortable with the idea of improvising. The news of another murder would come on December the 8th, 1977, with a phone call to an emergency dispatcher. Davis, a fireman who happened to be around, overheard a mysterious man speaking quietly into the receiver.
Dispatcher? Yes, you will find a homicide at 843 South Pershing, Nancy Fox. I'm sorry, sir, I can't understand you. What is the address? 843 South Pershing. That is correct.
Davis headed for the phone, but by the time he got there, the caller had already vanished. After some time, police arrived, and Davis shared with them what he could remember from that man. 6 feet tall, blonde-haired, industrial uniform, and drove a van with some sort of writing on its side. At 8:30 that same morning, police officers arrived at the address mentioned by the man, and Nancy Fox was found dead, lying on the bedspread. Once again, Dennis had taken his time to place her in the perfect position, and sperm was found at the scene. A recording of his voice was played over and over in the local radio and TV stations, but no one could recognize who that voice belonged to. He needed the recognition for his crimes, and on February 1978, he sent a letter to a local TV station with this message: "How many do I have to kill before I get my name in the paper or some national attention? Do the cops think that all those deaths are not related?" He then proceeds to explain the pattern in his murders, the pleasure he felt as he tortured his victims, and how he is under the influence of something called Factor X, the same that motivated killers such as Son of Sam and Jack the Ripper. There is no help, no cure, except death or being caught and put away. It's a terrible nightmare, but you see, I don't lose any sleep over it. After a thing like Fox, I come home and go about my life like anyone else, and I will be like that until the urge hits me again. Police had to announce a serial killer was active in Wichita, and mentioned his habit to cut the phone lines. He was finally getting all the attention and publicity he wanted. 14 months later, on April 28, 1979, Anna Williams returned home after going out with her friends. They dropped her off at her house, but before she could step in it, she decided she would go back with them to get a coffee. So she got back in the car, and they kept going for another hour. After having some coffee, she returned back home and discovered that one of her basement windows had been shattered, and saw pieces of rope lying on the bed in the guest room, and noticed pieces of jewelry and clothing missing. She tried to call the police, but the line was dead. She rushed to her neighbor's house and called the police there. 2 months later, a letter arrived at her house and was opened by her daughter. The letter said, "Be glad you weren't here, because I was." And also, it contained her mother's scarf and jewelry, a drawing of a naked woman lying on a bed, and a poem. She called the police and never showed this letter to her mother. BTK had already chosen his next victim, but she never showed up, and he aired his frustration in this poem. During the following years, Dennis murdered 3 other women: Maureen Hedge in 1985, Vicky Wegerle in 1986, and Dolores Davis in 1991. But police wouldn't link these homicides to BTK until several years later, as BTK would disappear for a very long time in which Rader would live a normal life, becoming a dog catcher, being elected president of the church council, and being a Cub Scout leader. Dennis took trinkets from the homes of his victims, which may have been one of the few things that quieted his head during this time. By 2004, the killer was considered a cold case, but he needed the attention, and in March, he sent a local newspaper a package that contained a photo from the murder he committed in 1991. And during this time, the police learned that BTK's kill count had reached 10 victims, and was possibly ready to kill again. Police came up with the idea of giving him someone to talk to, a super cop. He would appear on the news and talk directly to him, someone who would gratify his ego and make him feel important and comfortable to open up to him. The officer chosen for this was Lieutenant Kent Landwehr. Their interactions were friendly, complimenting each other, and this way, little by little, during the course of 11 months, he could convince BTK to trust him. During these months, he kept sending letters and boxes to the media, and eventually he let his guard down and made the mistake of believing that he could trust them to tell him the truth. One of the boxes was found in the back of a truck and handed over to the police. It contained a document detailing how his lab was secured with explosives, and on the last page there was a message that said, "Look, be honest with me. If I sent you a disc, will it be traceable? Just put the answer in the newspaper." The police answered his question and told him he didn't have to worry, and that it would be safe to send them the disc. On February the 16th, 2005, he sent the floppy disk to a TV station, and police could find data that was embedded in a Word document that Rader didn't know was still in the floppy disk. This metadata contained the words Christ Lutheran Church, and the document was marked as the last modified by Dennis. Police found that a man called Dennis Rader was president of the church council, and obtained a warrant to DNA test Dennis' daughter, which showed a familiar match between this test and the sample from Vicky Wegerle's fingernail. This proved someone from her family was related to the murder. And finally, this evidence was enough for police to arrest Rader. On February the 25th, 2005, the arrest took place. One of the officers commented that his heart wasn't racing, he wasn't breathing hard or perspiring in the least. He had never seen someone look so calm in a moment like this. It was as though he felt absolutely nothing. But later, he was shocked to know that the police had lied about the floppy disk. In court, Rader confessed to all 10 killings and received 10 consecutive life sentences. Nowadays, Dennis is still serving his life imprisonment sentence in El Dorado Correctional Facility, where he most likely will spend the rest of his life. Most of this information was taken from a book called Inside the Mind of BTK by John Douglas. You should check it out. And this is the end of the video. See you.